Hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1052nd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, Programs Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Helen Tworkov and Jared Bland. And now I will introduce our guest and host for today. Helen Tworkov is Tricycle's founding editor and author of Zen in America. She's also the co-author of Turning Confusion into Clarity and In Love with the World, which she wrote with Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. Jared Bland is an editor and writer who lives in Toronto and Cape Breton Island. He was formerly the publisher of McClelland and Stewart and vice president of Penguin Random House Canada. Helen and Jared, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll pass it over to you, Jared, to get us started.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks for having us. Hi, Helen.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm trying to figure out how do I get just you? So I'm not looking at the whole, do I do that?
That's the speaker view thing we were exploring earlier that you abandoned.
Okay, I'll then leave it. I'll just
It might be too late for us all.
Okay, fine.
It's great to see you, and it's great to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Brooklyn Rail, to Chloe and Carolyn, and to Eleanor, and everyone there for having us today. It's a really special thing to have the chance to talk about this book. So just to give you a little sense of how we'll spend our next hour and a bit, Helen and I are going to talk for a long while, during which I'll ask her a couple times to read from the book, so you'll get to hear a little bit of Lotus Girl in her voice. You can also, as a shameless plug, hear Lotus Girl in her voice in the excellent audiobook, which Helen narrated herself. Wherever you get audiobooks, you should check it out. And then we'll turn it over to audience questions and answers. So Chloe and Carolyn and Eleanor are going to keep an eye on the chat and be gathering those sorts of things, and we'll go back to them so you have a chance to ask Helen things directly later on. I want to just start by saying what an honor it is for me personally to be here to do this. I'm grateful, as I said, to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail, but Helen, especially to you, a deep bow of gratitude for asking me to join you here today to talk about this book. I want to take us through Lotus Girl as kind of best we can in a conversation format, at least. This book just came out last week. I'd imagine that everybody in the audience has already bought their copy, but maybe hasn't had a chance to read it just yet. So I want to give everyone today a sense of the kind of remarkable range and scope of this really, really special memoir. It's like all great memoirs, it is a memoir that looks at its subject with startling clarity and honesty and vulnerability. And also, like all great memoirs, it somehow transcends its subject and is about so much more. It's a book that spans time and place and straddles so many different worlds, you know, the art world that you grew up in, Helen. It's also such a vivid portrait of New York across many, many decades, from, you know, the 40s, 50s on to the 21st century. It delves so powerfully into the political and social upheaval of the Vietnam War era, the mystical power of Tibetan Buddhism, the sort of austere clarity of Zen, the magazine world, Nova Scotia, you know, we could go on and on. And I hope we'll get to touch on a lot of these different threads today to give people that sense I was talking about of the book itself. But just to start, I think it would be great, Helen, to hear about this book in your own words, what it means to you, why you wrote it now, and what you hope it does in the world.
I wanted to write something about some aspect of Buddhism in America that I was not reading about in other histories. That a lot of the histories I had read about Buddhism in the West, the coming of Buddhism to the West, the coming of Buddhism, the expansion to the convert community in this country, were basically following the pattern of the way a lot of histories are written. They went from big event to big event, and that mostly meant going from men to men to men and skipping all the in-between. And a lot of the in-between were the peasants, the working bees, the people who did the work on the ground. So many of us were not the most devoted students. We weren't necessarily the best students, but in our stumbling, bumbling way, we actually accomplished a lot. When I look around at what we've done in terms of where Dharma is in this country now, I'm completely astonished. So I wanted to write something about the kind of experience of that from the inside. So it wasn't just all kind of aha moments or big events, that it had something to do with a kind of daily life process. The other reason for writing it now was that I think that's in some ways my life, like everybody else's life, is completely unique, like every person's life. But when it comes to Dharma in this country, I feel like I share a lot with my generation of Buddhists. And what I share is a kind of trying to stumble towards some kind of sanity in this crazy world that we're living in. And whatever lessons I learned there are certainly ones that we could use a lot of these days. And so hopefully it gives some people some alternative, that there's something sane out there, that we're not just stuck in this totally insane world that most of us feel pretty overwhelmed by right now.
And your hope in writing it now was that it would speak into that moment with these lessons from your experience and those of your peers.
Well, when you say now, I started this book about 10 years ago. So I don't know what the now is, because there was a long stretch where I started it. I finished a draft. And then Mingyur Rinpoche, who's my Tibetan Buddhist teacher, asked for my help in writing In Love with the World. So I just put this book aside for 3-4 years and then went back to it. And by the time I went back to it, the society in which I was living in had pretty well fractured, or it had fractured in ways that we saw it in a different way. It was after 2016.
Yeah.
And we were looking at a very different society than the one we had been looking at, even though perhaps some of the things we were looking at had been there for a long time, but we didn't see them.
Yeah, you were looking at the ascension of certain elements that had been easier to avoid looking at previously. That's actually a totally new discovery to me. I didn't realize you'd written a draft of this before you worked on In Love with the World. That makes me think about this book totally differently. It's kind of incredible. Well, let's get into the material of it itself. This book is kind of loosely chronological. It follows from your childhood through to the present day, very nearly, a couple of years ago. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your childhood to kind of ground us in that. Your childhood in this book is so memorably described. You are the child of a revered, yet maybe we could say brooding artist, the abstract expressionist Jack Tworkov, and a beloved and brilliant, yet ultimately unknowable to you mother, who went by Wally. You write in childhood in particular of so often being split between worlds. You were raised in the sort of relative poverty of the world of artists before artists were, wealthy superstars. But you also had access to this sort of elitism of, Park Avenue apartments of art collectors who were visiting with your family, or, this kind of intense, complex, very interior family dynamic within your apartment. And then this almost feral seeming childhood on 23rd Street. You call yourself a street kid, kind of out there, wisecracking and tough talking and wandering around. Can you take us inside that and talk a bit about these juxtaposed and, these different dynamics at play?
I think it's really hard to take you inside a childhood, because when you're a kid, you're just living your life. And you don't, at some point in relationship to the art world, and only through the outside, and only when I started to go to private schools, not in public school. I first went to public schools, then I got a scholarship to a private school. So my cohorts became middle class, and their parents became part of the society, which had some kind of tremendous reverence for the art world. Only then do I start to see the art world through their eyes. Up until then, I wasn't looking at it that way. And so I could see that there were all these different sort of colliding things going on, something called artists, something called my neighbors I grew up in a tenement on East 23rd Street. There were the two prominent families in the building, both fathers were cops. That was a little different than than my own family's background. I talk in the book about a Bowery bum named Joe Gould, who has a certain reputation, literary reputation. He used to visit us because, I don't know, my father knew him as an artist. And then we had a very wealthy Park Avenue tycoon who used to come to visit us. So there were very vastly different economic elitist classism going on in all kinds of different directions. I don't know how I put that together. I think as a kid, I was pretty disoriented.
Yeah, you describe yourself as being disoriented as a kid.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, like, what would that look like for a kid? Because, you know, in the same way that the kid accepts whatever's around, wouldn't the kid sort of accept the disorientation as being like, wow, this is crazy?
Well, at a certain point, I began to enjoy the disparity. I didn't as a child so much, but at some point, I began to like that clash. I began to like that disjunction. But I didn't know.
To this day.
Huh?
To this day, something you kind of relish.
Yeah.
There's this sense in the book of this like vivid kind of intimacy of the New York of your childhood. Like you mentioned Joe Gould, like wandering around the corner from the Bowery. And there's this amazing description of after he leaves, your mother immediately goes into the bathroom with like a bottle of bleach or something to like clean the whole thing down because he always asks to use the bathroom.
Yeah.
I was struck, you know, I've told you I wanted to ask about New York. I couldn't quite think of how to do it, but it just popped into my head that like there's this kind of like smallness to the New York that you describe, and it happens again and again. Like, you know, you meet later your dear friend Rick Fields, and you realize that your parents lived together, just like up above, and then you end up, you know, living 30 feet away from that later in life, and then somebody else moves into the apartment your parents had on 23rd Street, and it's just this kind of like real intimacy of this not just art world, but kind of broader cultural world where musicians and artists and people are in open exchange in this immigrant community, this working class community. And it sounds kind of, it's, you know, unrecognizable to the New York of today, but it sounds kind of remarkable.
I think New York was very different in those days. I think it was. I mean, one thing is that I grew up in, for better and for worse, for whatever it was, even with the Third Avenue L there and the Bowery was right there. There was still a sense of neighborhood. We went to the same shops over and over and over again. My mother knew the shopkeepers. They had long chats about their families, and I don't know that happens. I live on West 20. I grew up on East 23rd Street. I live on West 24th Street right now, and I've had this little studio apartment that I've kept in the city for the last 20 years. Every place that I went to when I first moved here, that I enjoyed going to, like a little coffee shop around the corner, they've all been priced out. There's nothing like in this neighborhood. There's no sense of neighborhood. I mean, I don't consider the art galleries my neighborhood necessarily. It's not exactly a cozy sense of neighborhood.
Community building.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that might exist in some places. I think people who are living in Brooklyn, that might be more true in Brooklyn today. I'm not sure in some areas, but if it's maybe on the Upper West Side, I don't know really. It's not none of the downtown areas that I know of. Like I visit my sister a lot on Leonard Street. It's unrecognizable from when they first moved there.
Well, readers will get a vivid sense of what it was like in the book, because it's like you can smell the places because your descriptions of smells are so vivid in particular hallways and tenements and things like that. It's really amazing. You mentioned going to private school, so that's a natural place for me to plug. Helen has a really wonderful new website. They might have already linked to it in the chat. It features an extensive gallery of photographs from as relate to the book, like dozens and dozens of them, so you can see them. But if you are looking for a really great private school related Easter egg, you can go to the other writing page where you will see Helen's Dalton yearbook photo with a hilarious description of her. She has not changed at all since that description many decades ago. So just to close off on that one subject of childhood and that kind of art world thing, you know, you write really powerfully about that environment growing up. You describe yourself as, it's like that, asking a fish how's the water, and like that's just your world, right? But it instilling in you a sense of the kind of like primacy of a particular kind of intelligence, or maybe to say a particular kind of life of the mind. This veneration of a kind of intellectual activity through art making. And it strikes me that like in so many ways you've worked to release yourself from that way of seeing, through your spiritual practice and through so much of the rest of your life. Does that sound like a kind of fair way to think about it?
I'm not sure. I missed something. What is the actual question? What am I trying to trace
I'm
here?
asking about how you talk so powerfully about how the primacy or supremacy or valuation of a kind of intellectual activity was impressed on you as a child. You grew up in a world that revered artists as, I think you call them like the high saints or high priests. And you've spent the rest of your life working with your mind, which is to say, working with a different understanding of the way in which the mind works or can work for us. And I'm just interested in that tension and how you've worked to undo that.
So one of the things that I learned from looking at my art world background from the outside was people conflating art with artists. So when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about art. And I wasn't particularly interested in knowing about. I knew no more about art than the kids I played with on the street. I came from a building that had all these little boys in it. So I grew up with like 5 and 3, 8 little boys, my age, all around my age. Those were the kids on the street that I played with. And I knew no more about making art than they did. But because of the way artists were treated by art patrons, I got to understand that in certain circles, they were the high priests. So it wasn't that I grew up with I didn't grow up knowing anything about making art or what art meant, but I understood at some point that the high priests were not offer an elevated version of human beings. But they were, so there was something in the disparity between that was troubling to me. And but of course, I didn't really know that there was any alternative to that. But I think actually we kind of always, I think perhaps we all intuit that there is an alternative to that. We all intuit that there is something beyond the conceptual intellectual mind. Otherwise, there'd be no seeking in any way, including making art, I don't believe. Mm. So even, I learned at some point that making art can also be a search for some kind of transcendence, but I certainly didn't understand that as a child. So the kind of growing up with the sense of the supremacy of the artist did orient me to look for something else. And my first experience of that was that against all odds, and this is something that I go back to this incident all the time because I just don't understand it. My father gave me a book about Gurdjieff. For those of you who never heard of him, he was a Western mystic who died in, I think it was about 1959. He was very influential in kind of seeding the ground for Buddhism in the West, both in America and even more so in Europe, especially in France, where he had lived the last decade of his life or so. So that, and I was about 15, 16 years old, and I thought, oh, there's an alternative out there. This guy's pointing to an alternative. There's actually people who are alive today, and they're not artists living in New York City. I don't know where they are, but at some point I decided to try to go find them.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that book, because it strikes me as one of the most unusual, it's a book full of unlikely things happening. That strikes me as, in a weird way, one of the most unlikely, because it seems so out of character for your father, who, my sense at least is that he viewed your spiritual life with some skepticism, perhaps. For him to bring you that book at that age and kind of deposit it to you, it's just like a cosmic gift. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I really have no idea what he saw in me that made him want to give me that book, or how he saw a relationship. I've never figured it out. I've never gotten anywhere close to understanding it.
Did you ever get to ask him about it later?
No.
Hmm. I'm trying hard not to look at the chat because it's so distracting to get into what people are saying. But I did see one message pop up saying, "What's the website?" It's HelenTworkov.com. But then I saw another message pop up from someone who says they wrote the yearbook description of you that's featured on the website. So that blows my mind. Great. It's really great writing, whoever that was. Thank you. Thank you for it. Yeah, well, that's wonderful. The Miracle of Gurdjieff. Somebody asked the title of it. I have a copy over there. It's called In Search of
The book that I was given was In Search of the Miraculous by
Yes.
Ouspensky, and it was about Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff has his own
Yeah.
writings, but this particular book, which was extremely popular, was very popular in the years before there were any Asian Buddhist teachers coming into this country, before any of us, being the convert community, had access to Buddhist teachings. There was very little written, very little translated, very few teachers coming through. And so this was a kind of an introduction for a lot of us. And Gurdjieff was always very, very deliberately mysterious about his background. He didn't talk about where he studied. He refused to talk about where he studied or who he studied with. But there was it always had a deep feeling that he had been studying with Tibetan teachers in Asia. Yeah.
I remember when I first read Lotus Girl in manuscript 2 years ago, I was shocked when I got to that passage because an early teacher of mine had given me that book too, and I puzzled to think what he saw in me at that moment that could have been receptive to it. But it's been really, in a weird way, transformational for me too. So a nice connection. That's actually a great place to jump off into some of your travels. You mentioned you had a sense that there were people out there and you were going to go find them. The book has some really incredible, vivid writing about your travels early in your life in Asia at a time when it would have been extremely unusual for Westerners to be in many of these places, especially Western women traveling alone. You spend months living in Japan and Kyoto. You were briefly in Vietnam, you were in India, and for a very long time in Kathmandu, which seems to me to be the place where you found a particular kind of spiritual connection. What drew you to Kathmandu, aside from the mountains and the rats everywhere? Well, after that, I'll ask you a little bit about the title of the book, but tell us about Kathmandu in 1965 first.
I have to really kind of orient myself to remember it from then, because I just came back from Kathmandu. I've been there twice in the last 6 months, and it's changed a lot. But there are certain things that are pretty similar, and for whatever reason, the situation in Tibet was extremely raw. The Chinese had come in during the 50s. A lot of the Tibetans had come out over the Himalayas in 1959. And you saw a lot of people who were in a state of kind of shock of having to leave their country and leave behind family members that they knew had been killed or were in danger of being hurt, temples being destroyed, monks and nuns being harmed, the destruction of their culture. The Chinese didn't just set about to kill the Tibetans. One of the ways that they did that was to try to destroy their culture so that they had nothing to identify with. And we see some of that going on in different parts of the world today. It's not so different. And there was something about the Tibetans. I can't really tell you I know there were specific things that happened that I can talk about, but in a more general way, there was something about the way the way they moved, the way they looked, the way they talked, the way they ate. There was something just incredibly attractive and compelling.
And in Kathmandu, you found this community of exiled Tibetans, basically, and were able to kind of be in that scene.
Well, at some point, I started to volunteer in a refugee camp, and that was outside of Pokhara, which is in the west of Nepal. So one of my many jobs that I got right away, I was teaching English to support myself, and one of them was the Royal Nepal Airlines, and I could try to teach English, and in exchange, I got free airplane tickets. And at that time, they had 6 stops, and 2 of them closed because of the monsoons. So they were flying. So Pokhara was one of the places they flew into, and I could get free airplane tickets, rides to Pokhara. And so that camp was about a day's walk from the airstrip. There was no airport. If you go to Nepal today, there's a big airport in Pokhara, but in those days there was a cow field. As the plane hovered above the cow field, these women would come out and chase the cows away, and then the plane would land, and that's how it worked in those days. And I think part of my attraction to Nepal at that time too, for all of my travels, it was the only truly rural area that I was in.
Yeah.
Up until then, I was mostly in cities, so I was seeing a much more developed cultural face of a country, going to theater or looking at what people wore, or going to museums. And this was very different. This was all about people. It didn't have any cultural artifice around it. And I think that was part of the attraction, and what I could see so easily. So then a lot of my contact, I had a lot of contact with the Tibetans in Kathmandu, in the city, and also in the refugee camp.
Yeah, and even the city itself at that time was so much more rural. You were living near Tamil Durbar Square. For those of you who know Kathmandu, you describe looking toward the Swayambhu temple to the west, I suppose, and it's fields between Durbar Square and Swayambhu, which is wild to think about now. So it's a very different place. One of the places in Kathmandu that you spent a lot of time was a restaurant called the Tibet Blue, where you had another job teaching English in exchange for noodle soup. And it was at the Tibet Blue that the book's title came about. So I wonder if you could just tell us the story of Tenzin and Lotus Girl.
Yeah, to get from my apartment where I was staying to this restaurant, which they offered to give me free meals in exchange for teaching English. I had a great life, I was flying around and eating all in exchange for teaching English, which was also kind of hilarious because I came very close to flunking out of every school I was in because I couldn't pass any English exams, but I couldn't pass any reading and writing exams. But here I was teaching English. And so every day on that trip, I would pass a Tibetan trader, and he'd be sitting on a box, like an orange crate, and he'd be sitting on that. And then there would be a cloth below him, and spread out on that cloth were all these Tibetan items. And again, this is 1965, so the majority of the Tibetans had come out in 1959. They were trying to sell goods to survive. So he called me over one day. He called me, and so part of this story, to my mind, is that he had learned from the restaurant that I had volunteered. I was volunteering at a Tibetan camp. And he called me over and he said, Lotus Girl came over, and I was kind of laughing, like, haha. And he gave me this mala, these Tibetan beads that I still have. And he said, you take these Buddhist, and I said, I can't accept these from you. And he said, you take these Buddhist beads to America. And I still have them. And the string is broken many times. And every time it breaks, if it's in a public place, I lose a few of the original beads because I can't find them, but then I have it restrung and add a few more. And so that's the story of Lotus Girl.
And he just assigned you that name on the street one day. And then amazingly, you write that after that day, after you seeing him there daily, after the day he gave you that mala, you never saw him again.
I never saw him again.
It's pretty extraordinary.
It's like he waited for me to come back from the camp. I had been in the camp a week, and then after that, he was just done with that corner. He's going to move on.
He's moved on. Yeah, he'd sold enough spell cups, and he was going to move on to another spot. Yeah, I just love that. I love that story. Maybe we'll stay on the Tibetans for a while. This is a book that's full of teachers of so many different kinds. The teachers within your family, the teachers among your friends, the teacher of life, and kind of the greater whatever spiritual forces you want, however you wish to describe them. But it also is a lot of literal teachers, your many wonderful Buddhist teachers. And I could easily spend like a whole separate event asking you to tell stories about each one of them because they're all such vivid characters in the book. And so readers will get to know them all. But I thought maybe we could pick just one as a sample and talk a little bit about Dudjom Rinpoche, who was part of he was kind of at the center of this burgeoning Tibetan Buddhist scene in New York that you were a part of. And I wonder if you, maybe to introduce him to us all, if you would read to us a bit from the book about him and about Yeshe Nimpo, the center, which you can still go to, I think, on 16th Street. So yeah, could I invite you to read from page 154? Thank you.
I would just like to say in your description of a center of a burgeoning scene, in some ways it's true for the rest of us, but he himself never showed the slightest interest in this so-called burgeoning scene. Yeah. I mean, we were all extremely kind of excited, and we had all the exuberance of new converts and new religion, but I guess he was at the center of that in some way, but not in any way that would indicate that he was participating in that.
He's the center of it by default.
Yeah,
interested
exactly.
in it. Yeah.
So here I'm talking, it's what year are we in? We're in, I think, 1976, I think. And I talk about, I'll tell you who was at the center of that scene was John Giorno. And he was very key to that scene because he had actually raised the money to buy this townhouse on 16th Street. So I say that over the next few years, I spent a lot of time at the Tibetan Center. I had moved into Hermine and Bob's apartment. That's my sister, Hermine Ford, and her husband, Bob Moskowitz. I had moved into their apartment in the West Village when they relocated to Tricycle, which meant a 15-minute walk to Yeshe Nimpo and a 40-minute walk along the Hudson River to my job with Richard Serra. According to Richard, I arrived at his Tricycle loft every morning after picking up his mail at the Canal Street post office and then routinely tossed it unopened into the trash can. I remembered tasks that required a little more finesse. On many mornings, I walked Enoch, that was my dog, who features prominently in this book, to Richard's loft on Duane Square, and on many late afternoons, I walked north to the Tibetan Center, where I often cooked dinner for the family. For meals, Dudjom Rinpoche sat at the end of a rectangular table and faced the small windowless kitchen. His wife sat to one side with their family and guests gathered around. I had been a vegetarian, but once I began to fulfill the request for red meat, I began eating leftovers, pot roast, meatloaves, beef stews, and with the more fat, the better. Per Vivian's instructions, she was my guide to how to deal with the Tibetans. Per Vivian's instructions, white rice was never exchanged for brown, which steamed itself to sticky perfection in an automatically timed Chinese rice cooker. After serving the meal, I retreated to the kitchen to start cleaning up, but not without peeking out to gauge my efforts and watch Dudjom Rinpoche pick up his fork and put down his fork. Watch him place his napkin on his lap, see him delight in his daughters. This was my first experience of living Dharma, and it looked nothing like any ideas I had ever entertained about enlightened beings. To watch him was like looking at the sky. A quality of utter transparency prevailed, which is not to say that he was explicitly knowable, but that he was without affect. There was no place within his aura to land. Nothing about him engaged me in terms of my own sense of self, of who I was or where I was. There was no reaching out to invite you in, as one might expect from conventional encounters. There was nothing to adhere to, nothing sticky, nothing to inquire about, no information that one might use to know another. Wiping his mouth with his napkin or bringing his spoon to his mouth or turning his head towards someone talking was never accompanied by an extra gesture, an eye roll, a raised shrug, a sign of approval. His mind did not appear to follow the movements of his hand. His ears might take in sounds from different directions, but his mind did not appear to race around between the sources of each sound, so that, for example, he seemed to just listen without bringing to bear any preconceptions about the source of the sound. Everything about Dudjom Rinpoche was utterly natural. But what allowed me to take note of his exceptional behavior was the very absence of what we call ordinary, which turns out to be quite contrived. The way we size each other up, trying to figure out the other by dress, speech, bearing, using projections and biases, trying to understand who we are to the other or who they are to us. Generally, these responses make their way to the surface in the form of tension around the lips or eyes, or in gestures, a protruding elbow, a shoulder shrug, a raised brow. Mental activity, supposedly invisible, turns out to be anything but. Dudjom's mind did not mask movement, but appeared free from the compulsion to follow thoughts, to constantly move toward or away from sense objects. His eyes might move from one object to another. His ears might move from one sound to another, but his mind did not seem to follow. The photograph of Thich Quang Duc, and that's how the book opens, with a photograph of the monk burning in Vietnam in 1963. And this comes back again and again. So the photograph of Thich Quang Duc suggested that his mind had not followed or identified with the sensation of pain. Watching Dudjom Rinpoche through the open crack of the kitchen door felt like falling through space. I'll leave it at that.
It's one of my favorite passages in the book. Thank you for reading it. And anyone who's ever been in the presence of, I think especially a great Buddhist master, a great Tibetan master, has had that sensation or something like it, of just the, as you call it, living Dharma, and watching that experience. I mean, you characterized him a little bit for us there at the beginning as being at the center of, and yet entirely indifferent to, this sort of burgeoning scene. But can you maybe just say a bit more about what it was like to be in his presence so much at that time?
I don't know that I can add to that. I mean, it was, no, I mean, there's plenty to say about the scene. The scene was like many Dharma scenes then and today. It was pretty dysfunctional. But that wasn't about him. That wasn't about what it was like being with him.
What was your sense of what he made of New York and of being
I have
far
no
away?
idea. I wouldn't even begin to go there. I haven't a clue. I haven't a clue about what he made about anything. I wouldn't even attempt to project that. Sorry.
Wow. That's all right. That's all right. Well, we'll come back to the Tibetans maybe a little bit later, but I wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about magazines because we're, of course, being hosted by a great magazine, the Brooklyn Rail, and it feels only fitting to talk about another great magazine, Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, which you founded and which is now led by James Shaheen and his great team there. How did Tricycle come to be, and what was the moment like in which it was born? You know, what was the world of Buddhism in America, speaking of fractured communities, perhaps, like at the point of Tricycle's inception?
Well, the earliest conversations that I remember having about a non-sectarian magazine, you know, where practitioners from traditions from Southeast Asia and Zen traditions from Japan and Korea and Tibetan traditions could all come together. It was a kind of a very fun idea, like we could do this very fun thing and have this non-sectarian magazine. And that if we could just agree on a language that all these different traditions could use among each other, that we could use the same language to talk to non-Buddhists and to talk to people, reach a larger audience. By the time we actually started the magazine, those days had pretty well fractured. through it from the mid-'80s to around 1990, there had been various scandals in every one of those lineages, the Zen lineage, the Tibetan lineage, the Theravada lineage. And I say in the book that my friend Rick Fields by that time had published his wonderful narrative on the history of Buddhism up until, I forget what year it was. But the name of the book was How the Swans Came to the Lake. And after all these scandals, he joked that his sequel would be called How the Swans Died in the Lake. And we didn't really know at that time whether we didn't know whether Buddhism was going to just get blown out to sea or whether it was going to really be able to survive these fractures that were very serious and very deep and left a lot of people very hurt and very confused and wanting to leave the Dharma and being very critical. And so at that point, all of the small community-based magazines, they were kind of the house organs, they were all under the aegis of a male teacher, and there's community of this brotherhood of all the teachers. So whatever was happening in that community, we couldn't say anything about it in the magazine of our own communities. So it was all a kind of we were on the phone gossiping all the time, but there was no place you could publish anything about this. And yet for those of us living at that time, I was living at the Zen community of New York. For those of us who were involved in these communities, it's all we talked about. I mean, I don't know if it was all we talked about, but we talked about it a lot. And Rick Fields was at that point, he was living in Boulder and he was running the Vajradhatu Sun, which was Trungpa Rinpoche's house newspaper. And the motivation for the magazine kind of changed from just having a great time together to something that was a little bit more serious, that maybe the Buddhist community as a whole needed a forum where certain things could be discussed in a more open way. And so that's something about the background.
And it then was born into a fractured Dharma world, and of course itself became part of the controversies, I'd imagine. You write quite vividly of the difficulties of having everybody mad at you all the time about various things. And you have a really great way of framing it, like, I figured if they were all kind of equally mad at us, we were doing our job right, or something like that, which I think is good advice.
Yeah. Probably true of the Rail too. I bet it's true of the Brooklyn Rail.
I think it's true of any publication, as long as somebody's always going to be mad about something. And as long as you're conscious of how balanced the anger is, you have a sense of how you're doing. I love the chapters detailing the formation and founding of Tricycle. And Tricycle has done so many amazing things and contributed to Dharma in the West in particular in such important ways. And it's probably almost 35 years of existence. But I delighted in reading in particular about Change Your Mind Day, and which became a series of events, an annual event for 10 years or so called Change Your Mind Day. And for those of you who don't know it, I wonder if you could maybe read a little bit to us about the inception of Change Your Mind Day and tell us about what the first one was like.
Well, I probably don't remember that. But I'm gonna just talk a little bit about what leads up to that in a way, because one of my teachers at Yeshe Ningpo was Tinley Norbu Rinpoche, and he had many wonderful phrases. He had very fractured English. He didn't speak very well when he first came here, and so a lot of things he said had a particular kind of poignancy, precisely because because his language was not so perfect. And so one of his expressions was "useless is best." And in terms of meditation, or in terms of Tricycle, we wanted it to be useful. We all wanted it to be useful. So how did you put that together with useless is best? And I remember that I was going to visit, and this part I think is in the book, I was on my way to visit Joseph Goldstein at IMS at Barrie. And I was thinking about this phrase, useless and best. Oh, and also at that time, this is early on, like 93 maybe, because so much of my generation of Buddhists came out of the counterculture movement, there was a lot of attempts to fit meditation into various social engaged Buddhist activity. So there was meditation for world peace, meditation against apartheid, meditation for all this and that. And so I was thinking about that in relationship to useless is best. And there is something in, and so I talked to Joseph about it when I got to IMS, and we were talking about how some of the teachers use the term gaining mind.
Yeah.
So when you're meditating in order to, that's automatically going to trigger the conceptual mind. And that triggering of the conceptual mind is always going to take something away from the process of meditation. It's always going to run interference with something else that you're trying to do. So it's this combination of trying to be useful and maybe working flat out for something with absolutely no attachment to results.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, sort of more like what useless is best might have been closer to being, rather than just plain useless. But I was thinking about this idea of useless is best. And so I got this idea with all these different meditations. There were people doing meditations in front of the United Nations and against a nuclear armament. They were all perfectly good things, but something not, I wanted to play with the idea of useless meditation. And so, so this is following my talk with Joseph, and I say at the next Tricycle board meeting, and by that time Philip Glass was on the board, or he had been from the beginning. So I say it was held at Philip Glass's townhouse on the Lower East Side. I proposed a day of meditation in Central Park, free and outdoors, just like in the time of the Buddha. Teachers from different schools would present short talks and guided meditations. With a nod to Tinley Norbu, I suggested that we call it Meditation for the Hell of It Day. The concept was enthusiastically received, but Lex Hickson emphatically argued against using the word hell in the name. It's insulting, he said. It's demeaning. It's offensive. Then came the debate about the budget. Central Park required fees for usage and security. We'd need a tent for speakers, money for travel expenses, and porta potties. We had no idea how many people would show up. Our Buddhist be-in might be rained out, an estimated $35,000 gone. The pragmatists were about to prevail when Philip asked, if two people show up and one gets enlightened, what's that worth? $100,000, $1 million? The event became Change Your Mind Day and was a triumph. I remember the first year introducing the speakers from a raised platform to the side of a lawn in Central Park and looking out over a crowd of several hundred, which within a few years grew to several thousand. I was amazed, as I had been with the first issues of Tricycle, to have played a critical role in bringing about anything this marvelous. I was still so unfamiliar with my own capacities and astonished by the success of any of my efforts. It was a glorious sunny day, and the vibrations generated by meditations led by, among others, Sharon Salzberg, Gaelic Rinpoche, Enkyo O'Hara Roshi, and chanting led by Lama Surya Das and Allen Ginsberg, felt strong enough to imbue the entire urban chaos of New York with a few moments of sanity. Was that in itself worth the money? Who knows? Perhaps another Hui Neng might pass by. The sixth patriarch of Zen, Hui Neng, had been an illiterate woodcutter. One day at the market, he passed a monk reciting the Diamond Sutra, and on hearing the reference to, quote, the mind that abides nowhere, Hui Neng woke up, just like that. Many Zen stories situate sudden awakening amidst improbable circumstances. Whether or not these events ever took place doesn't really matter. Either way, they're a shot in the arm and energize the hidden potential for karmic connections or for what those so-called chance encounters that influence the course of our lives. even if they remain invisible. Anyone's life, any one of them might, and I'm talking about people passing by, any one of them might be the next Hui Nang, or perhaps they were persons of more ordinary talents. Still, anyone's life might benefit by learning that the world of confusion that we take for granted is not the only world there is.
And it goes right back to what you were saying earlier about the lessons you hope might be taken or applied from this book. I said this to you the other day on the phone, but I feel like Philip Glass gets many of the best lines in the book. He's got a couple of really, really, really good ones. I won't say one of the other ones because it will offend any Californians on the call. You have to read it and find out. You know, you talk about those Zen stories in the Sixth Patriarch, and you spent a long time, as you said, living in the Zen Center, Zen community of New York, studying with Bernie Glassman and with Maizumi Roshi. And then you went back to Tibetan practice in the 2000s. You met and started studying with a teacher named Mingyur Rinpoche. And this was after, a long friendship with Pema Chodron, and at Pema's, the monastery Pema's the abbot of in Cape Breton. You went to a retreat with Mingyur Rinpoche. And as Eleanor said at the top, you've since written 2 books with him. And I wonder if you could just tell us about Mingyur Rinpoche and your relationship with him, and what it's brought you in your spiritual practice. An easy question.
Well, it was not love at first sight. A lot of people talk about their spiritual teachers, that they met them and that was it. They just kind of blissed out into the sunset. The first time I met him, he was so young, for one thing. I think when I first met him, he must have been like 30 years old. He was very young, and I must have been twice his age. And I met him at a dinner party in Soho. But he mentioned that he was going to be doing a retreat at Gempo Abbey, and I have a house in Cape Breton, and it's right up the Gempo Abbey is just 2 hours up the coast. So I decided that I would go to that retreat. And what happened in Zen is that my own teacher had died, Maizumi Roshi. And then I had been without a teacher for several years. And I had continued to have a sitting practice, but I was getting very spaced out. And I was really confusing a lot of spaciousness, which we hear a lot about in practice, with spacing out. It was getting very, very fuzzy. And when I went to this retreat with Mingyur Rinpoche, he basically spent, I think, 5 days in a row asking a group of about 30 people, where is your mind? What is your mind? Where is your mind? Where is it now? And it was very, very specific. And even though the questions clearly pointed to arriving at those answers through a non-conceptual consciousness, the questions themselves had a kind of density. They had a kind of bullet-like quality, like boom, 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 boom. They were very, very concrete. They were pointing to something that was completely not concrete, but they had that quality in them. And I also think that I say in the book that Cape Breton was such a special place for me, that somehow to make that connection to him in that particular environment also felt very special. And it made it a kind of like an extra blessing, and or a kind of an auspicious moment for me. And then that winter, I went back to India for the first time in many, many years. And I went back every year, except for the 2 years during the pandemic, I didn't travel. But other than that, I've been back every year to either India and Nepal, or just Nepal, to his monastery.
It's a very special relationship, and I'm delighted that you were right about it there. And if anyone hasn't read In Love with the World in particular, that's definitely the one to pick up, unless you're deep into Tibetan practice, in which case Turning Confusion into Clarity is wonderful as well, but it's very specific about the Nandro practices. We're going to run out of time here in a minute, and I want to make sure we have moments for audience Q&A. So I just want to ask you a couple of last things before we hand it over. You know, whenever I've edited a memoir in the past, in my past life as a book editor, I always remind people that they get to make choices. You know, you do not have to. In fact, you cannot include everything in your memoir. And that means you get to undertake this process of looking at your life or the portion of your life that you're writing about and kind of piecing things together and making sense, or, you know, as you'd say in Buddhism, you know, seeing things as they are, hopefully. So I wonder if you could just speak about what you learned from the undertaking of this process, what you learned from your own life as you piece it together.
There is something I learned, and it came very late. I mean, I learned it from writing the book very late into the writing of the book, maybe actually not until I finished. I talked at the beginning about wanting to write about the peasant class in the Buddhist world. And I do think that there were a lot of people like me that took 3 steps on the path and then fell off, or then or had to pick themselves back up and kind of trudge forward, or took a step back and went forward, and really kind of stumbled around with a lot of confusion. And what I saw in the book was that despite it all, there was a kind of perseverance that I had never credited myself with. If you had asked me, even before I wrote the book, if you had said to me, you know, I mean, I would not call myself disciplined. Some people call me very disciplined because I know how to work really hard, because I can be extremely compulsive about my work habits, but I don't consider that discipline. But I saw in the book that despite everything, despite all the confusion and all the steps backwards and sideways, and that there was a kind of perseverance of going forward, that I stuck with it. And I don't think I had quite seen that so clearly.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. It's kind of like the, you know, in Buddhism, there's the 4 immeasurables, which are kind of these wonderful qualities that you cultivate. And each of them can be said to have a near enemy and a far enemy, which is like a different way of understanding the same energy at its bad version. And it's like, you know, often I think you have, one of the things I admire about you is you have such a wonderful stubbornness in the best of ways. Like you can be really, you know, have conviction in something. And I think that perseverance is like the wonderful kind of extremely positive iteration of the same spirit. And I see the same thing in this book. We're going to go to Eleanor in just one second, but I did want to just ask you as a last thought. You mentioned Thich Quang Duc, and the book opens with this very powerful description of the photograph that you saw that was transformational in your life, of him sacrificing himself in self-immolation to raise awareness of oppression. And I think it's been in people's minds in the last week, just because of the horrific incident in Lower Manhattan last week outside the courthouse, in which someone tragically died in a self-immolation. And, you know, I think of them as very different types of things, but I wonder if you could speak of Thich Quang Duc, why you started the book with that image that's so unforgettable, and what it allowed you to explore.
You know, it's curious because in the last, since Jared referred to this emulation that took place, I know everybody in New York knows about it, but if people are other places, I don't know how prominent it was in the news, but somebody set themselves on fire in front of, it got a tremendous amount of news, of course, because there were 10,000 reporters there covering the Trump trial. And people were sending me all this stuff about this self-immolation. I assume they were sending it to me because I put so much emphasis on my own experience of Thich Quang Duc. To me, they had absolutely nothing to do with each other. From what I could see of the person who self-immolated the other day, he was extremely disturbed. There was no real political logic to what he did. He had pro-Biden signs and pro-Trump signs, but he basically looked like he had a psychotic episode and had been having one for several weeks. They sort of charted his history. He clearly was not well mentally. And with Thich Nhat Hanh, I've always understood it to be a sacrifice. And there is a history in Tibetan, in Chinese Buddhism, of monks who self-immolated to protect the Dharma in some way. And in his case, he was trying to bring attention to the persecution of Buddhists in South Vietnam by a very fundamentalist, right-wing Catholic president, Diem, who is a very small percentage of Catholics that were the holdover of the French colonialists. It was primarily a Buddhist country. And we've seen photographs of other self-immolations by now. There was one to protest the Middle East war not that long ago. I think it was either in Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, I'm not sure. We've seen photographs coming out of Tibet to protest the Chinese. I've never seen anything that combined someone on fire with sitting in complete equanimity. That was what was shocking about that photograph. It wasn't just somebody who set themselves on fire. It was this combination of sitting without flinching. And so one had to ask what that was about. Of course, somebody told me the other day that there was actually a news program just the other night in which they showed the photograph of Thich Nhat Hanh and with this guy in front of the courthouse. And I think that they said it wasn't exactly the same, but in Thich Nhat Hanh's case, I think there was a real sense of sacrifice, which of course is something that, especially in America, we know absolutely nothing about. So we can't even imagine the possibility of somebody doing that to help protect or save other beings.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that hooked me so completely on that photograph was that it appeared to be that his capacity for that equanimity appeared to be coming from a consciousness that we knew nothing about. Just we didn't know anything about it. And so that was, I wanted to know more about that.
Yeah, and it sets you on a quest. And I won't spoil it because it's very near the end of the book. I think it's the end of the second to last section of the book. But you have dinner with someone and ask them what they see in that photograph. And the answer is so profoundly moving. So readers should watch out for that moment. I will hand it back to Eleanor to facilitate audience questions, with a huge thanks to all of you for being here, and to the Brooklyn Rail, and most of all to the wonderful, beloved Helen Tworkov for having me be part of it. Over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you so much, Helen. This has been such a meaningful conversation and such a treat. Thank you both so much. We've got a few questions here in the audience, and our first question will be from Fong.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Helen. I just want to ask a quick question before I go to a meeting. I remember my grandmother, who's also a Buddhist practitioner, who actually got to meet Thich Nhat Hanh. And one of the things that I remember as a child, when she meditated every afternoon at 4 o'clock, she had shaved head just like mine. And I remember one instant of the summertime where a big mosquito landed on her head, and I smashed it. And she was not disturbed by it. So the next day, where she was doing the same thing, meditating, and the Buddhist rope was spread on the floor where she was meditating. So the wallet is sitting on the floor. So I took a few dollars to take my friends to go to play ping pong. And last evening, coming home for dinner, and she looked at me across the table and she say, "Never steal again, grandson. Next time, ask." And that was the first and last time I ever stole any money. And so it's definitely true applied to Thich Nhat Hanh, because the reason why the extreme heat did not bother him, because he's already left the body. And that's the practice that came from the Theravadas, tradition. So definitely true. But switch back to you were mentioned about Gurdjieff, Helen, and the fact that your father gave you that book, it's curious to me because I wonder whether, because your father was born in 1900, I think. Am I right, Helen?
Yes.
He was 4 years older than Willem de Kooning. I just came back from the Venice Biennale thinking about de Kooning a great deal. And that first generation of abstract expressionists. And I was thinking about John Graham, whose real name is Ivan Dobzhansky, who wrote a very important book at the time. I think it's 37. It's called Dialectic System in Art. Hugely influenced on Pollock, de Kooning, Gorky, mostly immigrant, and your father was immigrant too. And I wonder in that context, because John Graham have claimed to have met Gurdjieff in Paris, which is so interesting to me because tied back to, of course, later we actually had Peter Brook who came to in the first year of our NSE, and I did manage to ask him the question whether he had met John Graham, which he said no, but certainly make the movie. He did make the movie Medium Remarkable Man that you mentioned, Jared. And that was, I think it was relatively late, must be late 70. So my question is very simple. I wonder whether your father or you have met Peter Brook by way of your mutual interest in Gurdjieff.
I definitely did not, and I don't think my father had any interest in Gurdjieff.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
The book had been given to him, and he gave it to me because he was not interested.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't. But Judge, I want to go back to something you said, Fong, about the thing with the mosquitoes, because I think it's not so difficult to learn to live with mosquitoes on your face, but that should not be taken to suggest that it's easy to live if your body is on fire. I think it's that's people have asked about that question about the burning, about how he sat there without flinching, and what that possibility is about. And I think one of the things you can learn in meditation, and this applies to the mosquito part, is you can learn something about the ways in which the consciousness and sensation are completely tethered, and the ways in which they are not.
Yeah.
They're not exactly one and the same. So there is this possibility that that you can accommodate the sensation of pain. Not so easy. But if you can accommodate having one mosquito on your face, and you can really separate the sensation from your automatic response to it, then you can learn, or you can begin to intuit something about what Thich Nhat Hanh knew about.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I no longer kill mosquitoes, Helen. So that was the first last time I did it.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book, Jared. Thank you, Jared. And back
good.
to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Fong. Our next question is from Rebecca, and I will ask on Rebecca's behalf. Rebecca wrote, can you talk about evolution and trends of interest of Americans in Buddhism back at the time you started compared to now? For example, what aspects of Buddhism are most appealing and applicable to Americans? Also, what about the Jew-Boo movement?
Excuse me? What was the last question?
Jew-Boo movement?
Oh, Jew-Boo movement. Well, the Jew-Boo movement, I don't even really know what that means. I mean, I know that's kind of a phrase that's been bantered around, and I know because if you look at the percentage of Jews in America to Jews in Buddhism, there might be a high number, whatever that's about. I've never quite understood. The first question was what say it again. What was the
The question is about the evolution and trends of Americans' interest in Buddhism, comparing when you started to now.
Okay. So I think it's a very positive development that so many people are even familiar with the word meditation, because when I started off in Buddhism, that was a kind of a woo-woo word. You know, if you refer to meditation, it was like completely conflated with deities or demon worship or all kinds of different extraterrestrial possibilities. And I think we sort of know today that it's something that can be considered very very normal, very ordinary, that it doesn't take exceptional accoutrements, it doesn't take an exceptional space or place. So we've become a lot more familiar with the whole concept. So I think that's a very positive step. I also think that the basic values of Buddhism are more needed now than ever before. I mean, I think that when we look at the world we're living in and we look at the degree of fear and panic and mistrust and revenge and anger, that it's just what we were talking about with the mosquito, that there's a way in which we can know this information and deal with it and try our very best to work to heal some of the problems that have been caused by these issues without slapping ourselves in the face all the time to get rid of the mosquito. There might be another route, a somewhat more sane route than banging our heads against the wall, like another term for slapping yourself in the face when you have a mosquito on your nose. So I think Buddhism, some basic, and it's not just Buddhism. My own path happens to be Buddhism and through meditation. There are other ways, but I do think that getting in touch with how your mind works and getting in touch with something about how you don't have to chase every negative emotion down the rabbit hole. Excuse me. I think that's really valuable information, and I think it's more valuable today than it has ever been before when I look at our own society. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you, Rebecca, for that question. Our final question, unless if anybody else would like to ask a question, please do feel free to write a message in the chat here. But our final question from the chat right now will be from GE. And GE will allow you to unmute. Moment.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you all. Helen, would you say, because I think you were just about saying it almost, would you say that your goals, which seem so parallel to Buddhism, are really to remove our clutter of ideas and concepts in order to get to the real truth of the possibility of penetrating, to really just show the truth itself?
I don't know that you have to remove them, as long as you know that, as long as you know the value of their own weight. You don't necessarily have to get rid of them, but it's very helpful to know how insubstantial they are and how impermanent they are. And then there's almost more malleability in how you can work with those concepts. You can't get rid of concepts. We're living in this world. So we can't get rid of concepts, but we can learn what their value is, and we can learn how to use them more effectively, really. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, GE, for that question. Thank you so much, Helen, for your generous answers to these. And of course, thank you again to Jared for your wonderful prompts and questions in the dialogue this afternoon. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and making these daily conversations possible. They also support our archive, which you can explore on our YouTube channel, and this conversation will be posted there shortly. The Brooklyn has been free and independent for 23 years, and a donation will directly support our writers, production staff, and operations. And we urge you to consider this through a link in our chat. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Kenny Rivero and Anesha Roy Chowdhury on the event of Ribeiro's new monograph, I'm Not a Painter, I Just Brush a Lot, from Charles Moffat Press. Thank you all so much for tuning in here today. And again, huge thanks to Helen and Jared.
Thank you.
Turn on your microphone.
Thank you so much.
Hello and
Yes,
goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ella.
so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Helen.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everybody.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Congratulations.
everyone.
Take care.
Go buy the books, everybody. Please go buy the books. Lotus Go. It's very
Thank you,
important.
whoever's saying that. Oh, Fang. Thank you.
Thanks so
Just want to
much.
take
everyone.
copies.
Okay.
Yeah, bye.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
Ellen. Congratulations.
Wonderful.
Thank you.